Okay, you ready for the next part of this Idaho 4 American Tragedy book? Let's go. So if you have not seen any of my previous videos, I have summarized basically from the prologue all the way to chapter 29, so please go watch that below. Starting on chapter 30, they're talking about a week before classes begin at Washington State University in Pullman, that in August of 2022, that WSU's famed criminology and criminal justice graduate program has attracted international elite people. There's going to be 7 women and 4 men joining that year, pursuing master's or PhD degrees. One student comes from South Korea, another Saw from Bangladesh, and Leon from Taiwan. They're talking about a meet and greet with Brian Koberger and how Ben Roberts meets Brian, that Ben is the second oldest in the group, and that he notices that Brian is painfully thin, his eyes move too quickly, and the bags under them are dark and too prominent for someone his age. They say that he says that he notices Brian never took off his jacket. But then the next statement is like, Ben assumes, wrongly, that he needs insulation on account of his willowy frame. Not sure what they mean by wrongly. Well, then if you continue going on, it says they started insinuating that because Brian was a former addict, that Brian might have been keeping his forearms covered in public to hide the telltale track marks of his past addiction. So they're assuming, that there's no facts or confident, fodder to that. They say that Ben is flattered when Brian comes to talk to him because Brian's in the higher PhD program where Ben is pursuing his master's, and that he brings up, him being Ben brings up to Brian that he's worked in security for TSA, and Brian was like, oh, I've worked for security too, so he kind of lit up when they had something in common. Ben asks where, and Brian, I guess, becomes vague and says, oh, back home, and doesn't elaborate. So then Ben starts talking about how when there's people for clearance that are actually cleared and they just don't have their paperwork and it's awkward because you have to reject them, or and Brian goes, I know exactly what you mean. And then he says, Ben wonders for a split second that if that is in fact true, if it felt like he might have been stretching. He later said, but at the time, Ben went with the flow. They say that Brian's very articulate. Brian is giving a bravura performance, playing the role of somebody he has never been, namely someone who belongs in a room. And I'm just like, why do they say these things? They keep trying to paint Brian in a light instead of just stating facts. And to me, this is like, let's find a narrative that fits that he was a murderer back then. Sometimes you don't see the signs of somebody. So I found this next part really interesting. It says that Brian turns from Ben and makes a beeline for the group of senior faculty members. Like a Wall Street CEO, one by one, he pumps their hands and works the room. I'm Brian, he says, and I'm excited to be here. See, what's bothering me about that is he's A, trying to elevate himself. He's in a program. And B, this is very contradictory with Gary Jenkins, the chief of Pullman Police, the retired one that's going on like a media tour right now, what he said about why he didn't give the internship to Brian, that Brian potentially couldn't make connections with people, is what his interpretation was of Brian. Yet you have Ben here saying something completely contradictory about Brian, that he is able to connect. He was able to go up and shake people's hands in a room that are above him, that are important people, and introduce himself. I know half of us wouldn't be able to do that. So it's very confusing. They're giving 2 different pictures of the same individual. Is he shy and not able to connect with people, or weird and not be able to connect with people, or can he go and work a room and shake everyone's hand? So chapter 31 starts with early fall 2022, talks about a redheaded French professor, Amelia. I'm not even gonna try her last name. I just call her Dr. P. Brian is in the next seat near Dr. P. He gets called. He knows he's going to get called on first if he's up in the front. And then it says Brian knows all about incels, because that's what they're talking about right now. That is involuntary celibates. Incels are members of a movement of frustrated men, all virgins, that sprang up on 4chan in 2014 just after Elliot Rodger committed mass murder and then suicide, the act that Brian studied back in Professor Ramsland's class at DeSales. The idea of the movement, started in Roger's honor, is that one day the incels will succeed in their beta revolution and overthrow the Becky, Stacy's, and Chads. But they're insinuating this whole incel theory, he was replicating Elliot Rodgers, but there's no sign of that. I haven't seen anything in his room talking about Elliot Rodger, or researching Elliot to the point where you're like, okay, he's trying to replicate. So it's kind of like a jump that they're trying to insinuate that. They say that this group is increasingly associated with violence. He says that Brian looks around, all the people in that class could be considered Becky's, defined by incels as feminists who dye their hair, post stupid opinions, and need to be dominant ones in relationships. Stacy's are the stereotypical nubile, used to male attention, prolific on social media, and then there's the hunky rich Chads. And then he says after Brian gives his presentation, the Becky next to him starts hers. Why are they calling people Becky's in that class? I feel like this book is more of that type of person than he is right now. He's paying attention to her, and then he peppers her with a bunch of questions, but we know that his personality is very much like, I have to prove my point. So that's nothing new. We know that that's part of his personality. That she's getting annoyed. Brian looks over at Ben as seeking affirmation, but Ben looks away. Some of the women are visibly pissed. Brian doesn't seem bothered by the discomfort. Elliot Roger would have been proud. See, I don't like that. Why are they doing that? Like, this is very, like... So obviously the source of this information is Ben. They're saying chapter 32 is fall of 2022, that a Dr. Hilary Mellinger does cultural issues, immigration, and homelessness, and that she asked him a question about it, and he doesn't know that one. That it happened at the end of the class, so that he leaves the room, so they didn't really know. No one can see if he's red hot angry or red hot ashamed, is what they're saying. So then they're talking about how the person he's trying to become came out because he couldn't, I guess, prove everybody wrong and that he's right all the time or be that kind of person. So he's like the stuttering, awkward guy from Pennsylvania, and he knows he can put him back, but you can't erase the discomfort of what just happened. Honestly, some of these chapters were a waste of time. I mean, this book is a waste of time, but I digress. But some of them just don't make sense why they're even in here. So it's fall of 2022 in chapter 33, and again, they're making an insinuation and bringing up Elliot Roger again, and I'm like, why do you keep doing that? Like, drop it. And then they talk about how August, Brian goes for an evening drive, so there is a pattern before the murders of him doing this. Says he drives when he can't sleep, nightmares and visual snow. Says he goes on Tapatalk, and he writes this: I feel myself slipping away. It is as if the ringing in my ears and the fuzz in my vision is simply all of the demons in my head mocking me. I fall asleep and I wake up quickly, but to bloody screams. Is any of this here? Am I brain damaged? No. Then why am I like this? And I put, why didn't anyone ever get him help? Back then, I mean. They say that Brian knows that the cohort gathers on weekends for a beer. No one has invited him to join, but they don't elaborate of who the cohort is. Like, who are those people? They're trying to say, like, Elliot Roger swung between two college communities in Santa Barbara and the Isla Vista one, and then Brian's doing the same between Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, trying to find a Stacy willing to date him. So then they go and talk about how he went to the Mad Greek. I don't know where they're getting this information from, because I don't know if we've ever heard of the officers finding out this information. It says he parks the car in town and heads to a place he's read about online, the Mad Greek. And I bet, how do they know this evidence? Then they say that he met Maddie, and I'm like, who is corroborating the story? Is there surveillance footage of him coming into the Mad Greek? It's just bizarre, because they're making a lot of insinuations or like saying things as fact, but we haven't heard any of that from like the police itself or documents reading them. So it feels very much like they're assuming that that's what happened. Then they talk about August 21, 2022, and how Maddie's sitting at her vanity, and neighbors like Lexi Pattinson see her nightly routine, and I'm like, ew, why are they watching her? I wouldn't be watching someone. Then they're like, oh, a passerby who would have stopped and stared would have known that she has a boyfriend on weekends. He comes and sits on her bed. His name is Jake. And that her mom looks exactly like her, and her grandmother, Deedle. They talk about Kaylee popping in from next door. Then they say they are so immersed in their phones and their coziness, never think to look farther than the sanctuary of their yard. They don't see anyone out there staring. And I'm like, how do they know this? They're not Kaylee and Maddie. They talk about how Brett Payne alleges that the AT&T records show that Brian's cell pings off the Moscow tower. The cells can ping from far away, is what I put as a note, so we're going to hold a pin in that. They talk about Corporal Payne saying on August 21st, Brian was there at King Road between 10:34 p.m. and 11:35 p.m. And I was like, is there metadata to show this precise location, or is it just pinging off a tower? They talk about the footage from the car stop, and I don't know why that was hidden for so long. This is the other one with the gentleman officer. The officer told him he had to change his license plates. They say he often goes stargazing, and that people in the Pacific Northwest try to get into his mind. What people? Be specific. I will be back. Make sure you follow and comment.